The most critical issue we're facing today is mental health.
I believe this is the most important issue because people are suffering, and they're suffering in silence.
Older generations don't understand what goes on in their kids' heads and what could possibly be hurting them.
It's stigmatized and it's not well understood.
The pressures of social media and the isolation that comes with that.
I think the struggle to be perfect and the struggle to do everything well and succeed.
I think there's a lot of pressure, especially from where we live and the schools that we go to do the best you can and be the best that you can be, which is great, but a lot of times it piles up and students can't handle all of that.
Older generations tend to see mental health as just this stigma that teenagers and millennials have kind of come up with.
The most critical issue we're facing today is mental health.
The most critical issue is mental health.
Mental health.
Mental health.
Mental health.
Mental health.
Good morning. My name is Rebecca Fitton, and I'm a licensed professional counselor.
Hi, I'm Jana Opperly, and I am a faculty member in the College of Education at MSU. I'm also a licensed psychologist. So we wanted to give you a heads up about our message for today. So here's our plan for today's message. First, we're going to cover some of the goofy things that we've heard during our work as mental health professionals. Then we'll talk about why are we talking about mental health, and specifically, why are we talking about mental health here in church? Then we'll transition to what Jesus would say. And spoiler alert, Jesus would say that we have to take care of ourselves and that we have to take care of one another.
As we've mentioned, we're both mental health workers. We wanted to start with some of the things that we've heard people say about mental health. One of the things that I often hear people say is that successful people don't have mental health difficulties or problems. So doctors or people who own businesses or pastors for that matter, or psychologists, they don't have any mental health difficulties ever.
Another goofy thing we've heard is that all mental illness is spiritual illness. And if you just pray enough, you won't experience mental illness.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I hear that one. I hear that one a lot. Another one that I hear a lot often is it's really selfish to take care of your mind and your body.
One that comes up for me is mental illness. That's a sign of weakness.
Mm-hmm. Kind of along with that is that seeking help is also a sign of weakness. So often even by the time I see people in my office, they have been fighting through a lot of these things that they think about mental health just to even walk through the door to sit and to talk about some of these things.
Yes, so during our message, we want you to keep listening because we'll address these statements and these ideas during our time together. So we'd like to throw you a discussion question. Have you heard any of these statements? Where have you seen these ideas show up?
So you might be wondering, why is talking about mental health so important?
We'd like to start with some facts and statistics for you. So, by the time they reach midlife, 80% of Americans will have struggled with a mental health disorder. So, depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder or bipolar disorder, 80%.
That's a lot of people. And in a given year, 19% of us will struggle with clinically significant anxiety, 7% will struggle with depression, 4% with post-traumatic stress disorder, and 3% with bipolar disorder.
Throughout this series, we've been talking about folks from the Gen Z generation. So in a recent study by the American Psychological Association called Stress in America, Gen Z, we learned that Gen Z is more stressed than any other generation before. So specifically, since 2009, the rate of 12 to 17-year-olds and 18 to 25-year-olds reporting a major depressive episode has risen from 8% to 13% of our 12 to 25-year-olds. Further, 1 in 10 young people has seriously considered suicide in the past year.
I just want to pause for a minute and reflect on those numbers, because those numbers are really high. 1 out of 10 young people would seriously consider suicide. That's 10% of people. And they're wild numbers even for us being in this profession. And so we are really glad that we are talking about this together today. It's super important.
So why should we talk about this now?
Gen Zs and millennials rate this issue as one of the most important issues of their time. And we're going to show a short video right now where some of them are talking about why this is so important to them.
My name is Stephen Ball. I'm 35. I'm a brother. I'm a son. I'm a nephew. I'm single, and I'm a lawyer. I think mental health is an important issue because I don't think baby boomers understand it as well. I don't think they had opportunity to. Access to mental health was different back then. The field itself was different. And I think as a result, many baby boomers grew up with stigmas and with a flawed understanding of how the mental health community can help them live their best life today.
My name is Mandy Anaya. I am a millennial. I am a professor within a PsyD program. That's a clinical psychology program. So I'm very much concerned about mental health. There is this thought that if you have a physical ailment, then obviously you go to the doctor. But if you have a mental ailment, then it's almost like a personality defect that you need to get over it. Anxiety levels are going up in terms of the additional pressures that we're putting on our younger generations and on our kids.
I'm Michael. I'm 36. I'm a millennial. I'm a son, a brother, a husband, a dad, an uncle. When I found a therapist and began going to therapy and getting counseling, as I shared that with some members of my family, some members of older generations, they didn't really know how to take it. Some thought of it as a sign of weakness, that I wasn't able to handle things on my own. At the same time, I joined a gym and started working out, and one of the statements was, "Well, good for you. I'm glad you're at the gym. I'm glad you're working out. I'm glad that's being the thing that's helping you." And so I think oftentimes the older generations maybe don't understand that we need to do things a little differently to be able to take care of ourselves.
Gen Zs and millennials are more open to talking about mental health than any previous generation.
We also wonder if technology is accelerating the curve. So in the past 10 to 15 years, social media use has exploded. So in 2008, there were a few million people who were part of Facebook, and now there are 2 billion people who are part of Facebook. And that's not even including some of those other platforms like YouTube or TikTok or WhatsApp or Instagram. Mm-hmm. We also know from a study of the members of the Gen Z generation that after spending time on social media, 20% of those folks felt worse after viewing social media than before. So this study didn't address those reasons, but we can speculate a little bit. Mm-hmm. And some of the reasons that we think that might be are that we really carefully construct our social media posts. So you see the best photo out of the 30 we took as a family. You don't see the ones where my kids are screaming and where I have crazy eyes and where none of us are looking at one another.
Yeah. I never post the things of when I just lost it with my children, or like what my house looks like after, a long weekend or something like that. I don't post that. Do you, Jana?
No, I don't post the dirty dishes after the meal, or my kids rolling their eyes at me, or me yelling. No, none of that. All of that gets edited out. So when you're looking at social media, you're only seeing those really pretty, shiny, potentially artificial moments. So another theory that we have about why people feel worse after viewing social media is that we use social media to medicate ourselves. So if we're feeling a little bit bored, we might go on it, or angry, or lonely, or overwhelmed. So we're using social media to meet these needs, but that's not the way it was designed. And ultimately, it's not particularly satisfying for meeting those real needs.
Right, right.
So let's transition to, why are we talking about this in church? Or what would Jesus say about mental health?
Yeah. Why are we talking about this in church, right? Like, I'd have these conversations with my kids at home about social media, but in church, why is this important? Well, it's important because mental health and mental health difficulties is not a new thing at all. There are plenty of examples in the Bible of depression or thoughts of self-harm or anxiety. Both Moses and Elijah prayed to God to die. They were so distraught they wanted to die. We see an example of King Saul, and I haven't done an assessment on King Saul, but sometimes there's a question of, like, does he maybe have bipolar disorder? Like, what's going on? Like, why has he have so many kinds of ups and downs? We see Abraham being so anxious when he goes into Egypt, that he lies and he tells everybody that his wife is actually his sister. His anxiety was so prevalent for him. If we read Job or we read Lamentations, we just see pain and difficulty and sadness in a lot of the different writers of Lamentations. And we even just see Jesus struggling on the cross, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he is dealing with such despair and difficulty. I mean, obviously a really dark moment, but we see that mental health examples of different feelings and thoughts and experiences happening all throughout Scripture. So these things are not new. We just don't always read the Bible with that in mind. And so the discussion question I would love for you to consider at home is, where have you seen people struggling with mental health issues, difficulties in the Bible? Have you ever taken time to read the Bible, like, with that thought in mind?
So getting back to why we're talking about this in church, we know from reading the Bible that Jesus cares deeply about mental health. We know that Jesus sought out people who were broken and messed up and hurting, and that he had deep compassion for them and brought them healing. So hurting people are so dear to God's heart. So for instance, in the New Testament, we have the story of the man who was paralyzed, and his friends were so desperate to help him that they broke through the roof. Some of our kids from Kids Creek might remember the story of his friends breaking through the roof and lowering their friend down through the ceiling. And at that point, Jesus, instead of being so angry that the place where he was had been invaded and that the structure had been destroyed, he said, "Your faith has made you well." We also have stories about Mary Magdalene. So we know that she was experiencing some significant distress. At the biblical times, they labeled it as demon possession. The Bible tells us that she had 7 demons inhabiting her. And from our mental health lens, we might have a different explanation. I'm not sure. It could be that she was a person experiencing schizophrenia or another disorder, but it also could be demon possession. But we know that Jesus loved Mary Magdalene as one of his closest followers, and she became one of his leading disciples. So rather than Jesus shying away from her because she was someone who struggled, He healed her and then made her one of the leaders of the early church. So Jesus tells us, he tells Mary and he tells us and other people who struggle, you matter to me. You matter to God. You're loved. Come and follow me.
Yeah. That's one of the things, even as the examples I was talking about earlier, like Moses and Elijah, like some of these people are like heroes of the faith, and it's just a really good reminder that God, even if we've struggled, like that doesn't mean that you're not really important to God and that you can do amazing things. And Jesus still heals today. We always need a relationship with Jesus and love from God. And sometimes we need medication or therapy or friends. For example, if you had a pain in your mouth, like you would go to your dentist. Some of you might take a little longer than others, but you would go to the dentist and say, I have this pain in my tooth. What do I need to do? And it could be a cavity. It could be you need a root canal. Like you wouldn't want to live with that kind of pain. But so often we live with mental health pain and difficulty without really addressing and figuring out what do we need to do to move through this. Jesus' story didn't end at the cross when he was feeling desperate and alone. And our story doesn't need to end in the midst of the struggle of mental illness or sadness, grief, or heartache. These things don't get the final word in our life. God works through people who come alongside us and carry us. God also works through the Holy Spirit, who is our comforter and can console us at times. He promises that he will bring good things from the awful things. In fact, that's like one of my favorite parts of being a therapist is working with people and helping us understand that sometimes the most painful things that we go through actually really teach us a lot about who we are or teach us a lot about who God is. It's just so hard and challenging in the midst of that to know those things, right? I mean, it takes time and it can take work to work through and understand these things. And God promises that the worst thing is not the last thing.
We know that Jesus doesn't cause mental illness, but Jesus can work through mental illness. And we know that because painful experiences are just part of being human. And I think about that as I think about that 80% statistic, that 80% of us will experience a mental health event by the time we reach midlife.
Yeah.
So if you're watching at home, chances are good that someone sitting in the room with you or that someone you love will experience a mental health difference by the time they're in midlife.
Yeah.
So what does Jesus tell us? Jesus wants us to take care of ourselves and one another. And we're going to use a funny churchy word to talk about that. So our word is stewardship. And when we say stewardship, we mean supervising or taking care of something. So stewardship is the word that we want you to think about as you're thinking about what Jesus would say to us right now. So as we think about stewardship, we think about stewardship in 3 domains or 3 areas. And those 3 areas are stewardship of our minds, stewardship of our bodies, and stewardship of our communities. So the first piece we wanted to address is stewardship of our minds. And we think about that in 3 ways. We think about stewardship of our mind in terms of our relationships, in terms of seeking mental health support, and in terms of our faith or our religious practices. So first we wanted to address those meaningful in-person relationships. And for me, the best illustration of this is the difference between a Facebook friend and a real friend. And I define a real friend as a person that you can really take the mask off with, and a person with whom you can be real and vulnerable and ugly You can reveal like the uglier parts of you and know that that person will still love and respect you.
Mm-hmm.
Another piece of stewardship of our minds is seeking mental health support. So Rebecca and I are both mental health professionals, and we've seen so many examples of individuals and families really turn a corner in their relationships and in their interactions as a result of that mental health support.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen families learn to get along with more harmony. We've seen kids start to relate to their parents in healthier ways. You do a lot of work with couples, and you see couples whose whole ways of interacting are completely changed as a result of your work.
Yeah. Can you tell people a little bit about just even that piece of, as we're talking about stewardship of our minds, right? Like the cognitive behavioral therapy that can be so helpful for people?
Absolutely. So cognitive behavior therapy looks at people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And we know as mental health professionals that when you change people's thoughts, you can change the way they see the world and the way they interact with one another. So one way to think about it might be looking at the tapes that are playing in your mind. So I use the word tapes because I'm an older person, but our young people might think about changing their playlist. So changing what they're hearing on their phone or changing what they're hearing through their AirPods. So one way to think about cognitive behavior therapy is thinking about changing the playlist in your mind. So when that playlist is negative and it's harsh and you're saying mean things to yourself, like, I can't believe you did that. You always do that. Why are you not good enough? Nothing you ever do is good enough. When we see people having that playlist, we know that they just feel rotten and miserable. And mental health professionals like Rebecca and I can help you to change some of those tapes, to change your playlist so that you aren't feeling those negative feelings all the time.
Because we have we have thousands of thoughts in a day. And so if they're really negative, our mind is going to be wreaking some havoc on how we're doing. This is all a part of stewarding our minds.
We also know that our feelings are really important. Would you mind just giving us a brief overview of the work you do with emotion-focused therapy?
Yeah. I help people really understand a bit more about how they're feeling about a situation, a circumstance, or what in a dynamic in a relationship, what kinds of feelings are getting churned up. Because like you were saying, our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors are all linked. And so I really help people understand what is going on for them on that feeling level as well, and help them really kind of work through, or even just labeling it is an incredibly helpful piece as we practice better mental health.
So when we think about stewardship of our minds, the third piece of that are our faith or our religious practices. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, in terms of our thought life, some of our faith and religious practices can be really helpful in terms of the way we think, like emphasizing gratitude, really kind of bringing your mind to the things that you are grateful for, having a prayer life, being able to pray for other people, maybe asking God for some of these things in our life to be comforted in moments of difficulty. Small groups can be another way of, sometimes we do need that friendships you were talking about, other people being able to say, hey, wait a minute, I think you're thinking about this in maybe a way that you sound kind of critical of yourself, like having meaningful relationships where people can say those kinds of things to us. We know that young people have actually left the church in droves. Young people oftentimes call themselves spiritual, but not religious. And from psychology today, some research shows that actually having higher rates of religiosity are oftentimes correlated with lower rates of depression and anxiety, substance use, suicidal behavior, and just overall well-being. And so we really feel like people are missing out. There's some really wonderful things that a healthy faith community can give to you in terms of your mental health and your well-being. The next piece of stewardship, with our fancy word, is stewarding our bodies. Can you tell us a little bit about one of the practices that's helpful with that, Jana?
Absolutely. So we know that our minds and our bodies are intimately connected. And one piece that really stands out when we think about stewardship and stewardship of our bodies is this idea of sleep. And it's such a basic concept, but I don't think that we can overestimate how important sleep is for our mental and physical well-being. So we know that when we sleep, our bodies are purging toxins. We know that when we're sleeping, our minds are turning those short-term memories into long-term memories. We know that when people don't sleep well, they just don't feel well. And we're both nodding because I think that we've experienced that, and we've seen that so often and for me, the kids and families, and you, the people with whom you work. So one small tip related to that is to think critically about your social media use right before bed. So we know that the blue light from technology really interferes with our wake-sleep cycles. And so one small piece of advice that we give to our clients is that they really avoid technology, and specifically social media, before bed. We say an hour before bed. And this is me noting like how countercultural that is and how hard it is to do that.
Yeah, most people have their devices right by their bed. I know I do too, right? And yeah, actually right before we go to bed and when we wake up is some of our most vulnerable time of the day. And so taking care of our bodies certainly involves having really good sleep habits. Also, exercise and proper diet and nutrition is a really important part of taking care of this body that God gave us. When we're not feeling well physically, we can start to have, like we said, where it's so tied together, we can start to, that builds and builds on itself. Another piece about taking care of our bodies also may include medication. And we want to acknowledge that many people might feel reluctant or hesitant about considering medication for mental health. But Jana and I were talking about this, and it's just very interesting. There's a lot of stigma around mental health and taking medication for mental health purposes. But I think a lot of us would consider taking medication for maybe a headache, or like if we had diabetes, we would take insulin because we would recognize like our body's not producing the insulin that we need to be functioning well. And so I just want to encourage people to think complexly about mental health and medication as well, because sometimes it is just really life-changing to be able to experience what is it like to feel like, wow, my thoughts can slow down. What is it like to feel like I can get through the day without feeling such intense anxiety? And so sometimes medication is also just a part of taking care of our bodies, this vessel that God gave us on this earth. The other piece of stewardship is really our community, that Jesus really wants us to take care of each other. And I know we've kind of hit on that a little bit already, but what would it look like if we were doing this well? When we love others, we're really doing the work of God. And I do want to thank the Gen Zs and the Millennials for really being so open about mental health. I think this is a really necessary conversation. And I think it's pushing a lot of us to be more open, more vulnerable with people about what's going on, with trusted friends, with small group members. I think these are really important, necessary kind of shifts that will really help us operate better. We can also then, we have the opportunity in community to practice compassion for people. When other people are sharing struggles with us, I want to encourage us to be non-judgmental, bearing each other's burdens, like carrying people when they're struggling. That is such, this is so close to Jesus's heart, that I think this is a big part of how we can be supportive around mental health for other people, especially if you haven't struggled with anxiety or depression yourself and somebody talks to you about that. I just want to really encourage you to be a good listener. I know we talked about that in last week's sermon too.
Another piece of stewardship of our community is pointing one another towards help. Like Rebecca said, when we have those close relationships, that gives us the opportunity to really support each other, and we can support each other through those one-on-one relationships, but also in encouraging one another to seek professional assistance if necessary. And I think for so many years, there's been this stigma in the church against admitting that we're struggling and against visiting mental health professionals. But I think you and I both see our professions as gifts from God and as tools that God can use to help bring healing to God's people. So we see our tools as mental health professionals as being really the work of God in bringing healing and restoration to the relationships in the people with whom we work. So one final piece of that stewardship of our community is thinking about really promoting that mental and physical well-being in one another. So maybe that looks like a small group that goes walking, or maybe that looks like a small group of people who are committed to changing their eating habits. We know that it's really hard to change those habits. So much of the work we do is helping people to change habits that haven't been so helpful for them in the past. And so we think that we can do this work well in our faith communities when we band together to make these changes. So we have a discussion question for you. Our discussion question is, which strategies from stewardship of the mind, stewardship of the body, and stewardship of the community have helped you to stay healthy?
Remember those goofy statements from the beginning of our message that successful people don't have mental illness, and that mental illness always equals spiritual illness, or that self-care is selfishness? What were some of the others? Oh, seeking help is weakness. They're all false. The real statements about faith and mental health are so much more complicated, and Jana and I could talk for a long time about these things, but we won't. Those are all false, and we really want to promote a community at Sycamore Creek of being a supportive place where people can be real, and can follow Jesus and can struggle still at the same time. We know that following Jesus doesn't eliminate these things. And we also know, though, that these storms in our life that we might have isn't the final word. So let's think about some next steps this morning. How can you steward your mind or your body or your community? Just pick one of those areas that we talked about and think about how you could practice better mental health by stewarding your body in a different way, or your mind, or the community. And that community might be Sycamore Creek community, but it might also be in your workplace. So thank you for being here with us today. And thank you for giving us this time to talk about mental health in church.